The Metal Gear franchise is in a difficult position right now. Following the creator's departure and a product that was panned across the board, it's likely that Konami is trying to think of a way to capitalize on the series' immense popularity. And in light of numerous PlayStation classics receiving successful makeovers, an obvious decision would be to remake the game that might have been that console's defining title, Metal Gear Solid. At this point, it seems inevitable, but in the midst of ongoing speculation, many fans have rightfully pointed out that the game has already been remade with 2004's The Twin Snakes. Completely overhauling one of the industry's landmark achievements was no small feat, however, and the GameCube remake didn't exactly live up to its lofty ambitions. The Twin Snakes is a fascinating window into remakes as a whole, and by dissecting the detrimental changes and analyzing the misguided direction of the project, I'm going to highlight the significance of having an unwavering commitment to a singular goal. But first, it's vital to examine the work that all of this discourse is based off of.
Exercises with the new China still maintain a negotiating table while you repel down.
Metal Gear Solid has a lot of cutscenes. Just as famous as the cardboard box and exclamation point is the series' copious amount of dialogue, and diving into the history of the series' creator clarifies this direction. As he was forced to watch a new film every single day as a child, Hideo Kojima's love of movies emanates through every creative decision he's ever made. From the original Metal Gear being based on 1963's The Great Escape, to Death Stranding featuring performances from Hollywood icons, Kojima's almost fanboy level of adoration for the silver screen has guided his maturation and gives him a unique perspective within the video game industry. And at a time when 3 dimensions and compact discs provided game developers with even more possibilities than they likely knew what to do with, Metal Gear Solid was astonishing because of its unrelenting focus on creating a cinematic experience. It's obvious as soon as you start the game. Voices have gravity and realism. They convey complex emotions, provide depth to the characters. Instead of having sprites just stand around and look at each other, the camera emphasizes certain relationships, captures a feeling of claustrophobia, creates a tone of horror and unease, lends the world a sense of scale. Credits fade in and out during the opening minutes of gameplay. The game has a director. The plot contains all sorts of twists, turns, dramatic revelations, and climactic spectacles. The music is intense and further contributed to the dynamism of the cutscenes. And that's exactly why some people don't like this game. Asking the player to idly hold the controller between their hands and watch during something that's meant to be interactive can come across as a rejection of the medium. In its attempt to be like a film, many people believe that Metal Gear Solid fails to justify its existence as a game. And perhaps they're onto something. After all, I chose to open this section discussing the game's presentation instead of its gameplay. While I understand this perspective, and I most certainly believe that interactivity can strengthen the impact of certain moments and ideas, I find this discussion to be unfairly constrained. To exemplify what I mean, I doubt any serious critic could lay out a convincing argument as to why Blade Runner is better written than Orwell's 1984, but recenter that conversation around their value as experiences and you suddenly have a far more interesting discussion. Reframing that idea, stripping Solid of its gameplay and fully converting it into a film might not result in a drastic shift in the quality of the plot, but you'd unquestionably lose a fundamental part of the experience. And that loss would include more than the core gameplay, as time hasn't favored MGS1's stealth mechanics. Guards have robotic search patterns and their vision is comically poor. Playing on the harder difficulties without the radar underscores how unfairly tight the camera is, and many of the game's combat options, such as choking guards, are rather clunky. This might be sounding quite negative, but in spite of all of these flaws, it can be surprising just how enjoyable sneaking around Shadow Moses truly is. You never feel like more of a movie hero than when you narrowly avoid detection, which is highlighted by some impressive cinematography. But beyond this, the game can be surprisingly unnerving. Scavenging for supplies while listening to the ominous score allows a player to really soak in Snake's dire situation, further enhancing the game's tone of isolation and unease. Transitioning Metal Gear Solid into a film would remove this depth, and fundamentally alter the suspense and ambience that the game handles so well. And with exception to the reveal that Liquid wanted to keep Snake alive so he could activate Rex, which is more of a general story problem, the cutscenes don't actively contradict the gameplay, and vice versa. All of this is to say that Metal Gear Solid didn't have to work within the framework of the medium to become a great game. It had to be a great game by providing the player a thrilling experience, and it's consistently entertaining enough to succeed through that lens. I actually think the area where gameplay and narrative overlap the most, that being the interrogation sequence, is one of the game's weakest moments because when you really step back and think about what's happening, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Ocelot doesn't even need any information out of Snake besides the secret to the PAL key, but Snake doesn't even know that at the time, and killing Meryl has nothing to do with his underlying goals. You can pick apart a lot of the individual scenes within the game like this, but that'd be a disservice to the broader strokes of the narrative, which fare much better. Many people like to say that MGS1 is about the horrors of war or how nuclear weapons are bad, and while that's definitely true, viewing the game this way limits its applicability to everyday life. Metal Gear Solid retroactively works within the larger theme of the series, that being the subjugation of individuality at the hands of external powers. From the ever-changing relationships between countries forcing soldiers to abandon their personal connections to information being manipulated in an effort to suppress free will, the Solid games are all centered around a man versus machine conflict. Machines that aren't the titular weapons, but instead systems designed to carry out the ideologies of people that have no regard for those that are grinded down and left to bleed out in the process. As I see it, Metal Gear Solid explores this idea in two key ways, the first and most obvious of which is the game's commentary on genetics. This is a slight subversion of the franchise's overarching message, as genetics aren't a result of human intervention, but this theme similarly challenges our sense of control within life. The game's message is that we can't let our genes restrict and steer our personal decisions. That's why Liquid's the bad guy.
You can't fight your genes, it's fate. All living things are born for the sole purpose of passing on their parents' genes. That's why I'll follow what my genes tell me.
This theme pervades the entire narrative in fairly clever ways. Naomi's a geneticist, the genome soldiers were strengthened through gene therapy, Fox Die specifically targets people by identifying their DNA, both the protagonist and antagonist are genetically related, and the recessive clone of Big Boss is the one who ends up victorious, furthering the idea that genes don't have to dictate our outcome. How this idea is expressed through dialogue leaves a little to be desired, however. Naomi flat out telling the audience what the game was going for robs them of the ability to really interpret the game's message, which would have been sufficient given how well portrayed the ideas are. This is why I think that the game's other view on the individuality theme, that being the government's manipulation of soldiers, is handled far better. Its representation is similarly extensive, but feels more powerful because it's far less direct. Gray Fox's final words are both brief and within character, so they don't take the player out of the experience, and Snake being kept in the dark about the true nature of his mission is a dramatic way to connect this idea to the player. While the themes are given an adequate amount of time to develop, many of the relationships aren't. To be clear, I think Snake and Otacon's connection is an exception. The transition from what's essentially a jock bullying a nerd to two vastly different men that both respect and complement each other feels earned because the script provides numerous opportunities for these characters to interact and grow. But the romantic relationships that both go through are pretty feeble. Wolf and Otacon's especially, these arcs fall flat because an insufficient amount of time is put into understanding what these characters feel about each other and why. I know I'm not alone in believing that Sniper Wolf's death is the emotional apex of the game, but it could have been even more powerful had her relationship with Hal been shown to us instead of expressed entirely through dialogue. Again, these flaws seem glaring when approaching the game with a critical eye, but Metal Gear Solid is often able to overcome its deficiencies through remarkable presentation. This is in large part because of its staggering focus on producing a cinematic experience that pierces through the entire game with astounding clarity. And its status as a classic is in no small part due to its success at achieving that goal. As I mentioned earlier though, time hasn't been kind to many of the game's assets. Its mechanics are dwarfed by the stealth games of today, animations are stiff, character models frequently clip inside of themselves, and so on. The appeal in remaking Metal Gear Solid is obvious. Instead of a game that's got great presentation in spite of its more outdated elements, a remake could renew those same elements to enhance what's already there, which is saying a lot given the quality of the source material. It was for these reasons, along with Nintendo's desire for a Metal Gear game to appear on the GameCube, that Silicon Knights completely overhauled the classic, resulting in the Twin Snakes. I only wish that it was considered a classic as well. The most apparent alteration is the gameplay, where the controls of MGS2 have been imported into Shadow Moses. Before exploring this design decision as it is in the Twin Snakes, I want to first establish that I think 2 has some great stealth mechanics that massively improved upon MGS1's foundation. First-person aiming adds an additional layer of challenge that more accurately represents the abilities you would have during an infiltration. Hanging over ledges and peeking around corners feels so natural that you can often forget that they're new additions. Most importantly though, these player buffs are balanced out by significantly improved enemy AI. The vision of the guards is far more extensive this time, and they're more adept at noticing when something is wrong with the environment. Throwing good mechanics into completely different levels isn't necessarily going to work though. Silicon Knights' president at the time, Denis Dyack, had this to say about emulating Sons of Liberty systems.
You have to change a lot. There's a lot of different ways now to finish some of the rooms and some of the levels compared to what you could do in the first one. I'll just take, say, one of the first rooms to the dock area, which was in the demo. You've got a set of lockers in the back there you didn't have before. So in the first game, if you knock someone out, you have to move the buy zone and try to hide them. In this one, you can just throw them in the lockers. And you can hang over the ledge if you're spotted by the guards, or if you're not spotted by the guards, you can sort of hang there and walk by them. Because you can shoot in first-person mode and you couldn't before, it changes a lot of the mechanics, it changes a lot of the fights, a lot of the boss fights. Then we changed a lot of the mechanics for the boss fights because of these as well, so it's sort of a growing snowball change. And so we have to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb and say, with this new additional gameplay, does this stuff all work? And sometimes the gameplay, say, from Metal Gear 2 doesn't quite work the same, so we almost have like a 2.5 now.
Dyack raises some great points here. I just wish the team actually followed their own advice. I've advocated for presenting players with choices before, so you'd think that having more ways to tackle any given area is a great change, but this can be undermined by the presence of a dominant strategy that makes all other options obsolete. This issue plagues the Twin Snakes. Take the upper entrance of the tank hangar's first floor as an example. In the original, it required the player to traverse a catwalk until they went downstairs to find the elevator. The challenge escalated from running past slow-moving cameras to navigating around more complex guards. Now, I'm going to play through this section in the Twin Snakes. See if you can spot the difference. Huh? By luring the guard from a different floor and throwing myself over the ledge, I'm able to completely breeze through this room without actually demonstrating any skill in the game's stealth mechanics. The escalation of challenge that was necessitated by the original's limitations has now become trivial. Neither of these two changes break the level design as frequently as first-person aiming does, however. It becomes all too easy to headshot guards like they're targets in a shooting gallery, reducing the amount of time where you're genuinely sneaking around them. Snake Eater had a somewhat similar problem, but that was largely negated by enemies that were well camouflaged with the environment, an obscene amount of trees obscuring the player's vision, and the lack of a traditional radar. Such accommodations aren't made in the Twin Snakes, which, in tandem with an extended health bar from the start, cheapens much of the game's tension. All of these problems are truly exposed by the bosses, where retaining the original boss patterns and arenas causes the core mechanics to collapse in on themselves. The original Ocelot encounter was a fast-paced back-and-forth affair where both characters frantically tried to overwhelm the other. The Twin Snakes boss? Well... Headshots knock off such a huge chunk of Ocelot's health that the player is incentivized to just stand in one spot and repeatedly shoot him in the face. But even if you don't utilize the first-person aiming, Ocelot's decreased speed and reluctance to shoot while running saps any and all excitement from the duel. The fight is now an anticlimax, and the whole point, that the player has to capitalize on the revolver's limited capacity, never even gets off the ground. Both sniper wolf fights are made easier by Snake's ability to aim the sniper rifle while standing up, which devalues positioning. Removing such a fundamental limitation also removes the challenge, and you can practically see the code running as Wolf pathetically jogs between positions because of it. However, neither of these encounters come close to the tragedy of Vulcan Raven. Raven was the best fight in the original. While other bosses emphasized shooting and combat, which were the control's biggest weaknesses, Vulcan Raven played to the game's strengths by entirely focusing on stealth. His immense vision and strength encouraged the player to stay hidden and use their various gadgets to gain the upper hand. And as players whittled down his health, he grew significantly faster and more aggressive, turning what started as a battle of attrition into a frenzied attempt to stay alive. The Twin Snakes once again largely maintains the design of the original while completely disregarding the altered gameplay. Now that players can shoot Raven across the entire room, they never have to risk getting close to him or bother setting traps, and using the tranquilizer doesn't lead to Vulcan Raven increasing his speed. The fight now settles into a brainless loop of shooting him in the head, taking cover, and then popping back out to repeat the process. Turning the original's highlight boss into a monotonous slog would have been bad enough, but one final change makes it a clown show. When taking damage in the original, Snake would completely fall to the ground and he didn't have many invincibility frames, which led players to quickly seek cover after getting hit and avoid head-on confrontations. Now, Snake just flinches a bit, making this a viable strategy. Enjoy. This, right here, is rock bottom. To be fair, not every boss encounter is a downgrade. For example, the first-person aiming is actually put to good use in the tank fight. The original battle consisted of blindly chucking grenades, and while you can still do that in the Twin Snakes, the ability to shoot the gunners is a welcome addition. I think the fight's a little dragged out because both soldiers have too much health, but it's a more fitting test of the player's skill. Mantis requiring the player to use 4 controller ports instead of 2 is also a nifty use of the hardware. It's a logical and creative extension of the original fight. But even with these improvements, the new bosses are a hard pill to swallow when so many others are completely broken by the new mechanics. The cutscenes following these fights also showcase a new problem that has serious ramifications on the narrative's message. I spent a considerable amount of time discussing the relationship between story and gameplay in MGS1, but this connection is tarnished in the Twin Snakes by the inclusion of one singular weapon, the Tranquilizer. It would go on to be a series staple, but I really question the decision to include it here given its implications within the plot. Liquid chastising Snake for enjoying murder makes absolutely no sense now if the player chooses to take out guards non-lethally. You could perhaps argue that you still kill the bosses, but that ignores the fact that they can be beaten with tranq rounds too, even if their death scenes would suggest otherwise. For example, having Snake fatally shoot Sniper Wolf with a weapon that I don't even have is an overtly contrived sequence that only disconnects the player from the protagonist. Sons of Liberty and Snake Eater were also flawed in this regard, but they never took it this far. The problem is especially bad here given Otacon's desperate plea to Snake that he doesn't kill Wolf, because that decision is now out of the player's hands even if they decide to take her out non-lethally. Kinda ruins this moment, doesn't it? A last-ditch argument could be that the tranq reinforces the theme of free will, as the player has the choice to subvert the fate that the plot has laid out for them, but any potential for that reading is immediately snuffed out when the game shows Snake shooting guards with a rifle that many players never used. This is what a true rejection of the medium looks like. Characters talking about gameplay events that not only didn't happen, but completely contradict intentional decisions that I made while playing. A lot of the game's commentary on war and violence is now lost, so why include the Tranquilizer to begin with? Just because it wasn't Sons of Liberty? Hopefully you're beginning to see a trend with these changes. The new design decisions not only clash with the old, they often run in complete opposition to it. That growing snowball of change didn't seem to really accumulate into anything. Drastically altering the gameplay would have already made the Twin Snakes a significant departure from its source material, but it is far more ambitious than that. Along with the mechanics are new visuals, a mostly different score, completely reworked cutscenes, and a re-recording of the lengthy script from the original cast. Had the Twin Snakes only implemented 2's gameplay, I wouldn't have made this video. It'd be a cautionary tale of haphazardly throwing ideas together, but at its core it would have still maintained the spirit of the original. That isn't what we got though. The main appeal of Metal Gear Solid was its cinematic elements, and changing all of it while upholding the original's quality is a difficult task, one that the Twin Snakes didn't exactly accomplish. Obvious at a first glance, the game has received a complete visual makeover. I'm not going to question the necessity for this change. The original features some indisputably muddy textures and low-poly models that would have been unacceptable in 2004. What I am going to push back on are the stylistic decisions made with these graphics, but before continuing I want to make something clear. I think that Metal Gear Solid is the better looking game, not because it's a more accurate representation of reality, but because it better utilizes its visuals to more effectively immerse the player into the world. As somebody who's played a lot of 8-bit and 16-bit games, I've noticed that it's easy to stop seeing pixels and sprites and begin viewing the game as its own unique entity. You start to understand the visual language, and it's easier for your brain to accept what's on screen as it isn't competing with your preconceived image of how something is supposed to look. Metal Gear Solid is very similar. People mock the faceless characters merely nodding their heads when speaking, but it's surprisingly easy for your brain to fill in the gaps and let the voice acting carry the scenes. Now that less of the visuals are up to the player's imagination, it's hard not to feel underwhelmed by the lifeless facial animations and subpar character models, with Otacon and Meryl being the biggest offenders of the latter. This is where technological advancements can actually become a hindrance, because the closer something is meant to imitate the world around us, the easier it is to pick it apart. With all that said, I'm willing to forgive the Twin Snakes on this front, because it does feel a little unfair to criticize the graphics by holding them to a higher standard. But a more unambiguously negative change is the remake's usage of colors and lighting, which doesn't capture the frigid nighttime air as well as MGS1 did. A great example of this is the sky. What was once a sea of black, punctuated with deep clouds, is now a bluish green or pale gray. Some dimmer areas in Metal Gear Solid also used intense vignettes to emulate a lack of light. Removing them really alleviates the darkness that once enveloped the player, and stripping the world of its ambience makes retracing your steps less engaging. Another element diluting these more immersive stretches of gameplay is the new music. I wouldn't say that the original soundtrack was as integral to the experience as a game like Ocarina of Time, but it was still a massive contributor to MGS1's tone. All of the tracks emphasized lower frequencies through piano, kick drum, or synthesizer stabs, which were often contrasted with steady hi-hats and reverberating percussion fluttering in and out of the stereoscopic field. This nicely captured both the swiftness required to evade detection and the gravity of the narrative. And I'll avoid going too far into the weeds here, but with exception to the cavern theme and Mantis' hymn, every song the player heard during gameplay was in the key of A minor. If you don't understand what that means, just think about every song focusing on the same few notes. Whether this was intentional or not is irrelevant. It wonderfully imparted the facility with a sense of cohesion. By comparison, the individual tracks within the Twin Snakes feel far more detached from each other and never quite capture the same sense of weight. The score is generally less focused on chord progressions and melodies than the original, and instead emphasizes rhythm and ambience, which really waters down the character of Shadow Moses. Just compare the amount of emotion flowing out of these tracks.
What happened to the music?
The Twin Snakes' music often lacks soul, and it chooses to largely forgo the choir that was the original score's backbone. Another change is found during combat. Every single area now has an intruder, battle, evasion, and caution theme, and each boss gets their own track as well. I appreciate the level of dedication, but this direction is ill-advised because it puts emphasis on the micro while ignoring the macro, and that missing holistic cohesion is something that Metal Gear Solid realized incredibly well. To clarify what I'm referencing, the encounter, duel, and escape themes were all variations of one another that differed in intensity to match the given situation. Boss battles were of greater importance than basic alerts, and escaping the facility right before it gets bombed was the climax of the game. The theme's rising intensity strengthened the story's more thrilling sequences to a great effect. Bringing this concept to every single area comes across as a wasteful endeavor that robs the climax of its potency. But if there's any one song that needs to be in this story, it has to be The Best Is Yet to Come. Outside of the beginning and end, the Twin Snakes uses melodramatic piano or guitar music in its place, which seriously undersells some of the game's more emotional moments. A lot of these cutscenes feel thin now, and it's hard not to notice the track's absence.
My father. He was killed in action when I was younger.
You wanted to follow in your father's footsteps?
Not really. I thought that if I became a soldier, I could understand him better.
So are you a soldier yet?
I thought I was. Until today. But now I understand. The truth is, I was just afraid of looking at myself. Afraid of having to make my own decisions in life. But I'm not gonna lie to myself anymore. It's time I took a long, hard look at myself. I want to know who I am, what I'm capable of. I want to know why I've lived the way I've lived until now. I want to know...
Take a good look. You won't be seeing mirrors.
Most of the time, however, the cutscenes are... eccentric. Before beating this dead horse into oblivion, I'd like to point out that there are some positives. Action filmmaker Ryuhei Kitamura used his position as cutscene director to inject some flair into Shadow Moses, and if these set pieces were in something different, I think the sheer creativity on display could be put to great use. And even within this story, some of these action scenes, however dated, are pretty impressive. Most applicably, Gray Fox's antics are within reason and fit the tone of such an unapologetically Japanese character. Unfortunately, that's the exception and not the rule, as a majority of these cutscenes run in opposition to what the narrative is trying to do. For example, ask anybody who's played Metal Gear Solid what some of the most memorable scenes were, and they'll likely recall the first appearance of Psycho Mantis. In a game that both was advertised as and at first felt like a gritty military story, seeing a guy in a gas mask and trenchcoat teleport after telepathically showing Snake a flashback while levitating served two functions. It was the tonal equivalent of getting ice water thrown down your back, and it highlighted the surrealness of Mantis as a villain. The intrigue spurred by this moment is completely gone in the Twin Snakes, because at this point, we've already been shown a bunch of nonsensical, over-the-top cutscenes. After seeing this...
So, someone needs to penetrate, gather intelligence, and report back. Sounds like a spy movie.
And this...
Did something happen?
There's an intruder.
Really?
And having the camera produce obnoxious sound effects ad nauseum. This is no longer a subversion of the player's expectations, but an expectation unto itself. Who cares if someone can float through the ceiling? After all, this is just some wacky cartoon adventure full of outlandish shenanigans. And it's not like Metal Gear is a series that can't or shouldn't be campy. Snake Eater has some goofy-ass moments, and it's still unquestionably the greatest game ever made. But both 3 and 2 use their more supernatural elements to create a tone that serves their narratives. By contrast, even with Mantis and the Cyborg Ninja Japanese anime, MGS1 is far more grounded than its sequels, and forcing these theatrics into the pre-existing story creates a tonal clash between the plot and its presentation. What was once a game that selectively used oddities to underscore certain pieces of its narrative is now a tone-deaf circus, with many of the original standout moments getting lost in the vast array of absurdity. And even by Metal Gear standards, some of this is way too stupid. Here are some of my favorite examples.
But how do I stop it? What? My hand!
but all of these pale in comparison to the singular funniest scene in any game I've ever played.
Let me tell you, it's... Huh? Oh, sorry. I forgot. Damn! Oh, that's right. It should be...
Beyond their consequences on the game's tone, the new cutscenes also undermine one of the game's better characters, Otacon. Most of his scenes in the Twin Snakes are played for laughs, which seems like an ignorant decision given his arc and placement within the story. Hal Emmerich is the anti-Solid Snake. He completely opposes violence, often lets his emotions control his decisions, couldn't lift 10 pounds, and probably struggles with talking to women.
I used to be an anime otaku.
Oh.
But he and Snake are alike in that they've been manipulated by larger forces for nefarious reasons. It's that whole individuality theme again. And Otacon uses his experiences in Alaska to accept more personal responsibility and use his skills for good. By taking wildly different characters and putting them in similar circumstances, the game is broadening its themes and creating an unlikely yet satisfying bond. I bring all this up to highlight that Otacon's frailty isn't a problem, but a fundamental part of his character. This is the reason we always see him limping with a twisted ankle, which isn't exactly the most macho of injuries. The Twin Snakes gets the meekness right, but completely mishandles it. The game is so obsessed with shoving something crazy in the player's face every chance it has that many of the scenes meant to develop his character and relationship with Snake instead portray him as the dorkiest person alive. Snake pushing him around during the conversation in the communications tower and having him fall not once, not twice, but 3 times during melancholic moments is blatant character assassination that damages the narrative's best relationship. Earlier, I likened the beginning of their connection to a jock bullying a nerd, but in the Twin Snakes, this isn't really true because it never develops past that. After playing MGS1, I understood why these two would go on to be friends. In the remake, it seems like Snake would try to get rid of this bum as fast as possible. I can laugh off most of the changes in the cutscenes, but seeing a good character get treated like this genuinely irritates me. Was completely ruining Otacon's character really worth it for a few gags? All of this absurdity could be compensation for the underwhelming voice acting, which might just be the Twin Snakes' biggest blunder. I didn't spend much time on this because it's all stuff you've heard before, but the voice acting in Metal Gear Solid is superb, especially given the time of its release. It isn't a stretch to say that the voice acting is MGS1's defining feature and its greatest success in feeling like a cinematic experience, so replacing the original recording is a massive risk that I'm not convinced was necessary. The justification for this decision is normally pinned on audio quality. The studio where MGS1's dialogue was recorded wasn't professional, and various noises from outside bled into the recording. Just like with the gameplay and character models, however, this limitation might have actually improved the experience. I'm not entirely sure if this was an artistic decision or a way to mask the bad quality, but the voices in the original are soaked in reverb during cutscenes. This lent the setting a great sense of physical space and can make the newer dialogue sound flat in comparison.
Now I'll show you why they call me Revolver. Now I'll show you why they call me Revolver.
Whatever the reason, the original cast came back to reprise their roles, with one major exception: Gray Fox. I get why this change is made. After all, Greg Eagles voiced both the DARPA chief and the cyborg ninja, which was a little hard to unhear once you noticed it.
They were designed by Armstead, the system developers, as an emergency override.
Listen, there's a tank in front of your position waiting to ambush you.
Newcomer Rob Paulson has a completely different tone of voice than Eagles, but with this first comparison, that's not what I want you to listen out for. Instead, listen to the amount of passion and intensity in Frank's voice during both battles.
More! Do you remember, Snake? The feel of battle. The clashing of bone and sinew.
Do you remember, Snake? The feel of battle. Clashing of bone and sinew.
You can really feel Fox's pain in the original, and it's believable that his dying wish is to fight Snake. In the remake, he just sounds kinda bored. It'd be easy to criticize Paulson for turning in a mediocre performance, but I'm not going to because just about every voice actor does a noticeably worse job this time. A great example is the codec call following the ninja fight. In the original, you can practically hear the memories and emotions rushing through Snake's mind, while he only sounds mildly surprised in the Twin Snakes.
Gray Fox. Colonel, that ninja is Gray Fox. No doubt about it. Gray Fox. Colonel, that ninja is Gray Fox. No doubt about it.
Roy Campbell now comes across as apathetic and often lacks urgency when the scene calls for it.
Master Miller's body was just discovered at his home. He's been dead for at least 3 days. I didn't know because my codec link with Master was cut off.
Master Miller's body was just discovered at his home. He's been dead for at least 3 days. I didn't know because my codec link with Master was cut off.
However, the real victim of the downgraded voice acting is Naomi Hunter. It is genuinely painful to hear so much life and emotion drained out of one of the game's better characters, and a lot of the story's most emotional moments ring hollow as a result. Take the explanation of her family and backstory, which is a pivotal scene for understanding her motivations.
He was a young soldier when he picked me up near the Zambezi River. I was half dead from starvation, and he shared his rations with me. Yes, Frank Yeager. The man who you destroyed was my brother and my only family. He was a young soldier when he picked me up near the Zambezi River. I was half dead from starvation, and he shared his rations with me. Yes, Frank Yeager. The man who you destroyed was my brother and my only family.
Here are some more quick examples that don't require much elaboration.
What are you waiting for? Shoot!
Don't talk to me like a rookie!
I'm telling you, shoot!
What are you waiting for? Shoot!
Don't talk to me like a rookie!
I'm telling you, shoot!
Look out, Snake! The guys who stole my stealth prototypes are in there with you!
Look out, Snake! The guys who stole my stealth prototypes are in there with you!
I think the point is clear by now. Whenever the Twin Snakes tackled a surprising revelation, a scene meant to humanize the characters, or an emotional disclosure, it's completely watered down and lifeless. The question is, why is this so much worse than what we already had? Jennifer Hale was great in the original, and went on to give amazing performances in other games. Paul Eiding and David Hayter provided significantly better interpretations of their characters preceding and following this one. Chris Zimmerman was the voice director for both versions, and she does an amazing job with every other game in the series. So, again, what happened here? After some reflection and speculation, I feel like the Twin Snakes fundamentally doesn't understand Metal Gear Solid's narrative. Now that might seem like a hot take, but think about it. Why is exposition constantly interrupted by goofy bullshit that doesn't advance anything? The game seems to view these verbose conversations as boring, and uses super epic action-packed cutscenes to hold the player's interest instead. Indulgences like these only derail and distract from the plot though, and treating the dialogue like it's secondary to the action in a game that has such a complicated narrative is horribly misguided. And as dialogue is delivered through voice acting, less care was put into it. The result is that, even with the completely insane cutscenes, exposition and codec calls are ironically boring disasters because the game doesn't respect the enjoyability and utility of these scenes. Before moving on, I want to sit here for a moment and focus on the one scene that encapsulates all of the Twin Snakes' problems: the death of Sniper Wolf. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to show both in their entirety, which does cheapen them a bit. But even without that context, pay attention to how sound editing and music are used to underscore this tragic moment.
Why? Why? I loved you.
What is it?
My gun. Give it to me. She's part of me. Everyone's here now. Oh, okay, hero. Set me free.
Goodbye.
Snake, you said that love could bloom on the battlefield. But I couldn't save her.
In The Twin Snakes, after Snake epically 360 no-scopes her, we get this.
I loved you.
What is it?
My gun. Give it to me. She is part of me. Everyone is here now. Okay, hero. Set me free.
Goodbye. Snake, you said that love could bloom on a battlefield.
The aforementioned dissonance created by the tranquilizer takes the player out of the experience. Reduced darkness makes it harder to be immersed in the moment. Awkward character models and animations don't properly convey the emotions they're meant to. The music, or lack thereof, fails to accentuate the scene's sentimentality. If there's ever a place to use the best is yet to come, it is right here. The once grounded voice acting feels stilted. Goofy antics completely shatter the somber tone. A word I've avoided using throughout this entire video is atmosphere, because it's an umbrella term that fosters every single component of any work of art. By now, I hope you can feel what I'm talking about. I and many other fans returned to Metal Gear Solid for this very reason. The series would go on to have tighter stealth gameplay, stories that were more emotional, themes that were more complex, but that feeling, that sense of reality rapidly disintegrating around you on a cold winter night is something that shines through all of the outdated mechanics and murky visuals to this day. The problem with the Twin Snakes is obvious. Almost every change it makes comes at the expense of the game's atmosphere, with each decision further chipping away at the experience's tone until it's this empty husk of ambiguity. On top of generally being inferior to the original when directly comparing the two's assets, The Twin Snakes is a bad remake because it fails to uphold, respect, and amplify the true appeal of the classic it's based off of. Over the last 30 or so minutes, I've been slightly disingenuous. Not to say that my comparisons weren't apt, but my analysis has hinged on a presupposition that the Twin Snakes was aiming to become the definitive version of Metal Gear Solid instead of an intentional deviation. Even the game's most staunch defenders won't describe the remake as a replacement of the original, but an alternate telling. And for a series that so heavily focuses on individuality, who am I to say that the Twin Snakes shouldn't have an identity of its own? Evaluating the quality of art through the lens of something else can be unfairly limiting. Tropes or cliches that we call objectively bad can be put to great use if they're used correctly, and one game might choose to push aside successful elements of other games to further focus on a specific goal. Comparisons can be enlightening, but shouldn't dictate something's value. To really drive this idea home, I'm gonna flip this entire video on its head, because we've been staring at a perfect example the whole time. Metal Gear released for the MSX2 in 1987. Due to the computer's technical limitations, Konami newcomer Hideo Kojima envisioned a game about avoiding combat instead of high-octane action. A novel concept at the time, Metal Gear is a great game for two reasons. The admittedly simple stealth mechanics are surprisingly tense, and, more importantly, the game has a great sense of progression. For example, within the enemy fortress, Outer Heaven, there are various POWs that the player can find and rescue by exploring. The greatness behind this mechanic is twofold. Firstly, rescuing enough prisoners awards the player with increased health and a larger inventory, and secondly, saving allies is completely up to your discretion. This creates a strong bond between the player and rookie soldier Solid Snake because the rise of his heroism, a direct result of the player's actions, is adequately met by an increase in player strength. This focus on progression is also expressed through intuitive level design. Starting out with nothing but bare hands and cigarettes, players gradually find new weapons and tools by utilizing both their knowledge of the base and their extensive inventory. Take the sequence where the player acquires the RC missile. It's frustrating to not have the necessary key to open this door, but that irritation leads you to naturally go back to it once you quickly find card key 2. After some backtracking, a new weapon awaits you, and that tool then allows you to continue forward. If it isn't clear by now, Metal Gear is basically an early stealth interpretation of Metroid, ending self-destruct sequence and all, but its progression is bogged down by a few crucial oversights. Most infamously, doors have no indication as to what card key opens them. Because cards don't stack, you can end up wasting a lot of time sifting through the inventory, an especially annoying process if you don't have the correct card. The way forward can also be needlessly cryptic. Items can be farmed by exiting and re-entering rooms, which weakens the difficulty, and there are plenty of segments reliant upon trial and error that seem designed to piss the player off. Metal Gear is a pretty rocky experience, but it's still a satisfying blend of exploration and espionage that could be greatly improved by a sequel. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake was released 3 years later, and in many ways it's a monumental leap forward. The vision of guards is now conic instead of linear. Snake can crawl along the ground to avoid detection. Players have to be attentive of guards off-screen, embedding Zanzibar with more tension and a greater sense of life. But beyond these improvements, 2 places far more weight on the narrative than its modest predecessor ever did. The game tackles war with surprising maturity and gives characters fairly complex motivations. Big Boss is a great example of the latter. The once one-dimensional twist villain returns to provide the game with themes of individuality and society's failure to care for those that protect it. Given how I've described it thus far, Metal Gear 2 sounds like a clear improvement over its predecessor, but there's a catch. The original sense of progression is compromised. To be clear, level design still requires an intricate understanding of the facility. Backtracking is once again encouraged by numerous locked doors, and cards have been improved by the inclusion of a few skeleton keys, but the true issue isn't what it takes, the prisoner system. Instead of having to earn strength by deliberately going out of your way to be a hero, 2 hands out upgrades after every boss fight, which feels forced. It's technically still the byproduct of gameplay, but largely revoking this responsibility from the player makes them feel like an observer rather than a participant. And that's indicative of Metal Gear 2 as a whole. It still resembles Metal Gear and is probably the better game, but it seems to prioritize narrative over progression to the gameplay's detriment. After the rise of three-dimensional games in the mid-1990s, Kojima returned to the franchise again, releasing Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation 8 years after Metal Gear 2. Most notably, Solid uses significantly more powerful hardware to fully realize the narrative ambitions of its predecessor. This is achieved through extremely lengthy cutscenes that are fully voice-acted, with a significantly greater emphasis on presentation than just about every game that had preceded it. Also taking heavy inspiration from 2's story, Metal Gear Solid deeply explores themes of identity and agency while presenting players with a thrilling sequence of events. Just about every other aspect of the game is a downgrade though. Stealth is far less engaging because of shortened guard vision, and it didn't even seem to be as large of a focus. Compare the amount of enemies found within Metal Gear 2 and MGS1. Zanzibar Land has around 50 guards in its first building. Shadow Moses has less than 25 throughout the entire facility. But while stealth has been largely relegated in favor of action set pieces, progression is mostly stripped out. Health and inventory are once again expanded after bosses, but unlike Solid Snake, MGS1's backtracking doesn't amount to much of anything. Key stacking and doors being marked are welcome changes, and the way forward is consistently more clear, but exploring Shadow Moses is hardly ever mandatory, with locked doors usually leading to nothing more than rations, ammo, or situational gadgets that aren't necessary for progression. An exception arises when hunting down the sniper rifle, but this is facilitated by cutscenes rather than level design. You no longer have to learn the ins and outs of the base, you're just led to wherever the plot needs you to be. The core appeal of Metal Gear, that being its tense stealth and progression, has been completely sidelined to make room for a story that doesn't improve the gameplay. Therefore, Metal Gear Solid is a bad Metal Gear game because it fails to uphold, respect, and amplify the core appeal of the games that preceded it. The analogy should be clear by now, so I'll drop the facade. Just as the Twin Snakes is unsatisfactory when looking at it through the lens of Metal Gear Solid, MGS1 is surprisingly weak when you compare it head-to-head with its prequels. But looking at it for what it's trying to achieve gives us a greater appreciation of it, because, while divergent from the series up until that point, the game has a clear commitment to creating a cinematic experience that it executes masterfully. That gap, created by the loss of exploration and progression, is successfully filled in by the presentation. The appeal has shifted, but it's still the better of the three games. If you've been hoping over the last few minutes that this is my way of explaining why the Twin Snakes is a misunderstood gem, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, because all of this highlights the true reason that the Twin Snakes fails as a remake. It doesn't commit to anything. At the very beginning, I exemplified both Final Fantasy VII and Insane Trilogy as successful remakes even though they have wildly different goals. Along with its new combat, Final Fantasy VII Remake liberally changes the story and brings intensive focus to once unimportant gameplay segments. It can be enjoyed as its own unique experience. Meanwhile, the Insane Trilogy is an incredibly conservative attempt to update the original games, with newer content being entirely ignorable. Many fans believe that this collection can replace the originals. The problem with the Twin Snakes is that it tries to have it both ways. It wants to breathe new life into the mechanics and presentation, while also rigidly conforming to the original in an attempt to remain faithful. These jumbled priorities are evident when looking behind the game's production. The back of the box claims that the Twin Snakes is the definitive Metal Gear Solid experience, and Denis Dyack stated in interviews that the remake is a sufficient replacement of MGS1, while conversely, Kitamura was intentionally changing the tone of the cutscenes at the request of Kojima himself. You could argue that the former is just cheap advertising, but this schism permeates the entire experience. Enhanced stealth mechanics completely trivialize the old level design. First-person aiming dismantles the unaltered boss patterns. The new Tranquilizer contradicts Liquid's unchanged monologue. Different lighting and music fail to capture the original setting. Wackier cutscenes set a tone that undermines the pre-existing characters. This might sound overly restrictive for a video where I've criticized the one-size-fits-all approach, but a remake's goal should be to either preserve and update the original or completely reimagine it. I don't see any value in this ambiguous middle ground the Twin Snakes resides in, because getting pulled in antithetical directions invites a host of antithetical mechanics. Had the team reined in ambitions by only tightening the controls and streamlining some occasional inconveniences, we would have a safe but worthwhile remake that unquestionably preserves the original's appeal. The Twin Snakes actually contain some smart examples of this, like doors automatically opening without having to equip the pan card and optional ways to cut down on backtracking, but they're buried under a litany of dubious design decisions. On the other end of that spectrum, a total upheaval of MGS1 could have merit as its own thing. What needs to stay the same? I'd say the story, but nothing else is so sacred that it can't be revised. Let's briefly imagine a hypothetical remake using the Phantom Pain's mechanics. What if Shadow Moses was expanded to have far more rooms, and each area was completely redesigned? Creating more levels would show off the great stealth mechanics, and the underwritten relationships that I criticized would have more time to naturally develop. Sniper Wolf's second battle could be reimagined to resemble encounters with the End or Quiet. Slightly rewriting Ocelot's interrogation could clarify his intentions. The game could check the player's kill count and alter Liquid's monologue to more accurately reflect the decisions made by Snake. Some of these differences might not result in a satisfactory experience, but at this point, a remake clearly starts to stand on its own. What we instead got with the Twin Snakes is, ironically, a game chained by its faithfulness, and its reluctance to choose what it wants to be prohibits it from breaking out of those shackles. Metal Gear Solid is the better game, not just because it has superior voice acting, stronger atmosphere, and more consistent gameplay, but because of its unwavering focus on presenting a cinematic experience that still shines just as magnificently as it did over 2 decades ago.